And let's return to the situation in Melbourne. Joining me now, two Victorian senators. Liberal Senator James Paterson from the Labor Party. From the Liberal Party is James Paterson. Sorry for confusing that. From the Labor Party, Kimberly Kitching. Thanks both for your time. James, I apologise for that, but the two of you do agree on things from time to time, so maybe that's what was confusing me. Kimberly, let me ask you first of all about the announcement by Daniel Andrews. There's been some voices pretty disappointed by this. What did you make of it?
Well, look, I think that everyone is worried about the health as a first measure, and then obviously businesses and the empty shops. Of course people are worried about that. But just in the news report you just had on, Tom, you had a story about Wales and needing to go into a lockdown, or the UK, and certainly in some of the European countries there's going to be a lockdown, and France has imposed a curfew. So I would say that this obviously has been very tough, and Victorians have done it so tough. And I can tell you just, anecdotally this morning we had constituents ring in to say that it was taking 60 to 90 minutes to get a haircut this morning, because hairdressers opened at midnight last night, and there was very long queues at hairdressers in some of the suburban shopping centres. So people, this has been a really difficult period. I think it's very difficult for people from other states to understand how difficult this has been, but we are. It looks like we are out the other side, and I think that Melbourne will emerge bigger and better after this. And we've got such great facilities here that will resume.
All right, James, let me ask you. So this is the latest example being given on the same day that Victoria peaked at 725 cases. That day in the UK they had 763 cases. So there's been criticism of just how harsh this lockdown has been, but right now you wouldn't really have a debate over where you'd rather be, the two different constituents right now, would you?
Tom, it's no question those results are a great tribute to the Victorian people and their perseverance under incredibly difficult circumstances, and the way in which they have rallied together and abided by the incredibly harsh restrictions that have been imposed on them for a second time, and particularly that they've done so knowing that this entire second lockdown was only necessary because of the shocking public policy failures of the Andrews government, allowing the virus to again escape from hotel quarantine after effectively achieving elimination from the first wave of the virus early this year. Their perseverance and willingness to go along with that's been very impressive. But I want to strongly agree with something that Kimberly just said there at the end of her answer, which is that people outside Victoria, and particularly outside Melbourne, don't really understand just how dire things are. I've just arrived in Canberra after time in Melbourne, and can I tell you the utter devastation in the small business sector in particular, the mental health issues with young people in particular. We are all going to be picking up the pieces from this mess for years, if not decades to come. And frankly, the political and petulant display by Daniel Andrews as Premier at his press conference today was appalling and uncalled for, and particularly his attack on Josh Frydenberg, because all Josh Frydenberg was doing was giving voice to thousands, if not millions, of Victorians concerned about this so-called road out. When you've got people like Professor Catherine Bennett, the Chair of Epidemiology at Deakin University, absolutely panning it with a number of her colleagues in The Age today, other health experts out there highly critical of this road out. I think it's well within the Treasurer's rights to speak out that way, and very petty of Daniel Andrews to object in the way he did.
But I mean, they're both speaking out. Daniel Andrews obviously has experts on his side. What's the difference between what Josh Frydenberg had to say and Daniel Andrews? They're criticising each other, are they not?
Well, Josh Frydenberg has never said that Daniel Andrews doesn't have a right to speak out, that he doesn't have a right to defend his government, but Daniel Andrews has said that the Treasurer shouldn't be speaking out and should be quiet. In fact, Daniel Andrews has said that these people are from Victoria but not for Victoria. Now, that's an appallingly divisive with us or against us rhetoric. Criticism of Daniel Andrews' government is not only entirely legitimate, it's frankly warranted given their appalling display of performance before the hotel quarantine inquiry, every day at that press conference that he does. When people like Brian McNamee, the chair of CSL, when people like Sally Capp, the Lord Mayor, when every small business association, whether it's the hotels, restaurants and caterers, small local traders associations, are crying out, then it's entirely appropriate for the Treasurer to say what he has said, and it is entirely inappropriate for the Premier to object in the way that he did today.
Is there an inherent issue, do you think, Kimberley? The government clearly, in a broad sense, wherever you want to pin this down, has caused this second wave, that the government is also responsible on how to get out of it. The meaning of that is they're going to be so cautious, they can't afford to be blamed for a third wave, and perhaps they'll be overly cautious or are being overly cautious.
Well, can I just go back, Tom, to this divisive playing political games? We are now where we are, from 700 plus cases down to 4 today. So that is a real achievement. And it has to be done. Remember, there's also a board of inquiry whose report will be finalised and will be public in early November, and they're having an extra day of hearings tomorrow. So there is a great deal of accountability. Daniel Andrews has never sought to evade accountability and responsibility. He said, I am responsible. The buck stops with me. He has said that, often. So, and he does do those daily presses, and he stays until every question is asked and answered. So, and if he doesn't know, he takes things on notice. So I think that there has been a level of accountability that we have not seen, in fact, from the federal government. So what I would say is, what happens when the stimulus package measures end in December?
Who's responsible for hotel
what happens when that
new
finishes?
Information? We're going to have new
can I just say, though, on the stimulus
quarantine inquiry? Yeah.
Yeah, and there is an accountability there. So, but we have to remember that Victoria is going to be in a worse position compared with other states economically, and to have the Treasurer come out and say, well, look, we're going to leave Victoria by the side of the road, as he did a little while ago, that Victorians will not forgive, and they will not forget that they may be left behind by this federal government. And I think that there is a real problem with the federal government trying to blame a state in a sort of a collective blame sense that they are going to, not help. I think that's a terrible message to send to Victorians.
Do have a couple of topics quickly to get used to. I know you've been, both of you, asking questions about some journalists from the Xinhua Chinese news agency. They were actually in Parliament House. There was a little bit of I suppose, mystery around what they were doing and where they were allowed access to. James, what can you tell us about this?
Well, Tom, there was a serious incident in Parliament House on the 26th of June this year where Xinhua journalists and guests into Parliament House that they had signed in turned up to a press conference of the Prime Minister and started to film other Australian journalists in an apparent attempt at intimidating them. We now know that on that day, 2 Xinhua journalists were raided by ASIO in connection with the investigation into the Shaukat Mosulman foreign interference allegations. And I think it's time for the Parliament to think very carefully about whether state-sponsored media from one-party authoritarian states like China and like the Xinhua News Agency are allowed to have unfettered access to Parliament House. They can roam freely in Parliament House, and they can sign in whoever they like to access Parliament House.
So what are your thoughts on that? Should they be allowed?
Well, in an age of disinformation, state-sponsored disinformation and espionage, I think it needs to be carefully looked at in 2 respects. One is the criteria for permitting access for journalists to Parliament House. These people are not Woodward and Bernstein. The best case scenario is that they're doing stenography for the Chinese Communist Party, and the worst case scenario is that they're involved in state-sponsored disinformation and potentially espionage, which they have been accused of elsewhere in the world and in fact expelled from some other countries elsewhere in the world because of their connection to that. Now, I'm not in a position to make judgments about those because I don't have access to classified briefings, but our agencies are, and I think the Parliament and the Press Gallery Committee needs to work together to resolve this issue, because ongoing unfettered access for these people in Parliament House, I think, is a security concern.
Where do you sit on this, Kimberley? I suppose this is sort of freedom of press, but whether you consider genuine media coming from here?
Well, obviously we need a free press because that is one of the pillars of a liberal democracy, Tom. But what I do think, and I feel for the journalists who are being filmed, is that we have many examples of our open source data being used and being collected, and the recent database that was on public figures, on the Overseas Key Individuals database that was, is exfiltrated out of China, is another example. And I think that what we do need to do is we need, in where our information, our openness of our system is potentially going to be used against us is, I mean, that is not going to be sustainable. And I think to take photographs of journalists, you know, who are just doing their job, and, you know, you have to ask why they were photographing other journalists and why they were filming them. Was it to actually put in some sort of database? I think these are really serious questions and serious issues that must be looked at.
Just got 30 seconds left, but James, is it hard to have a blanket sort of decision on this? Is it case by case? I mean, you could get people from Vietnamese media, another communist country, but an ally of Australia, for example. How do you do this?
Look, Tom, there's very good reasons why you wouldn't want politicians to be in charge of which journalists had access to the building. It's very easy to imagine how that could be misused. But I want to make sure that the Press Gallery Committee has the resources that it needs to make these assessments, it has access to the information that it needs to make these assessments, and that as a parliament we agree what is the criteria for someone to be admitted to our building without any kind of oversight and scrutiny, because incredible freedom is granted to people who have a parliamentary pass, and I think that should be a very high bar should be met to be granted that freedom.
James Paterson, Kimberley Kitching, appreciate your time today. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom.
Thanks, Tom.
Thank you.